This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Lee Schulz, Iowa State livestock economist, starts today's show with the cattle market update. He discusses how pre-report expectations compare to the released cattle inventory and cattle on feed reports. Continuing the show is Terry Griffin, K-State precision agricultural economist, and Kathy Draeger from the University of Minnesota, with how things in space could impact Earth in agriculture. They say we are likely nearing another event. K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts completes today's show with information about voles and how to manage and control them. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week's livestock economist to join us is from Iowa State, Lee Schulz. Lee, thanks for joining us this week.
Glad to be with you again.
Laying the foundation, as we normally do, talking about the cattle market, what does the cash cattle market look like?
We've seen prices slightly higher as you look across most cattle trading regions, roughly, maybe a slightly higher to $2 to $3 higher on the week. I think when you look at what happened in futures trade, a lot of sideways trade overall for the week. If we look at the contract, we were roughly down 15 to 70 cents, depending on what contract you looked at. I think that really fell over into when we looked at cash trade and really just steady to a little bit higher. The fundamentals are still very much there. When you look at slaughter levels this last week, they were down roughly 5% compared to a year ago levels. Some of that has been because we did see some plants do some cooler cleaning, run maybe shorter hours, 40 to 32 hour weeks. And certainly that contributed to the lower slaughter pace, which is very typical during summer periods. That certainly contributed to softer box beef values as we look at, we get a little bit weakening in that demand as we get into the dog days of summer. And so that contributed to box beef values being down roughly 1 to 2% for the week on those slower slaughter levels. When you look at the bright spot maybe in the cattle market is feeder cattle. We did see stronger feeder cattle prices on the week, even with stronger corn prices. So corn prices for the September and December contract were up roughly 20 cents. We were really remaining in that weather market, even though we've seen, some negative news as of late. We have, continued to at least hold corn prices higher. We've seen them soften, but they have rebounded. And with that, though, we've continued to have strength in feeder cattle, really on the tighter supplies and the strength we've seen in fed cattle prices.
So nothing too surprising from the cattle market for this time period.
We'll talk about some reports here in a minute that does maybe start to talk about some of the change in trajectory of these markets, but really not too much to react to this time of year. And that's really what we're seeing playing out in these values. But I will underscore, we are seeing very strong prices. You compare it to a year ago levels, we were trading 5 market average for fed cattle at 141. Right. And we're in that, much higher 180 plus range. And so very strong values for this time of year. And I think some possibility we do see stronger values as we get into the latter part of 2023.
And talking about those reports from the USDA and National Agricultural Statistics Service, first talking about the report that went out on July 21st, the cattle on feed report, what were kind of some pre-report expectations versus what you actually saw in that report?
Pre-report came in, all numbers expected lower, the on-feed number as well as the placements and the marketing number. Where we are with current supplies, that's not too surprising. I will highlight the one number that always has a big range on it is that placement number. So while it was expected below year ago levels at about 2% below year ago levels, it had a range of down 4% to up 2%. It actually came in at the very top end of that range in pre-report expectations, actually up 2.7%. So as we look at a surprise from this report, It's certainly that placement number. Do I expect this to be all that bearish on the market? Not so much. I like to remind folks, when we look at that placement number, certainly it means we've put more cattle on feed, but if we're pulling them forward, it doesn't mean we're not adding additional cattle, right? We're just kind of pulling them forward in those feedlots. When you look at where those placements really occurred, Kansas was up 5% compared to year ago levels. Nebraska was up 5%. And then what USDA, categorizes a lot of other states. When you look across the placement weights, it was up 9%. So a lot of lightweight placements. You think Kansas, Nebraska, up 17, 18% compared to year ago levels for the under 600 pounds. So I think, it's a combination of things. We've seen dry weather persist in parts of the U.S., and that has caused us to pull those feeder cattle ahead. And we remain really tight on feeder cattle supply. So, right, as we continue to try to keep those feedlots full, we're continuing to pull on feeder cattle and pulling on, lighter weight animals as we look compared to year ago levels. So, to summarize, I don't expect this to be that much of a bearish report. It's probably neutral. The placements numbers, I think, while they were larger than pre-report, not that surprising given when we look into some of that placement data and where they came from and just looking at lighter weight placements. One other thing in that report is every quarter USDA looks at the number of heifers, looks at the number of steers, and so we can look at the percentage of heifers on feed as a percent of the total. And why that's important is because it can kind of help us judge if replacement heifers are being held back and maybe starting that herd rebuilding process. So we've been at really high levels, number of heifers, which has actually helped mitigate the tight supplies because we've added more heifers into feedlots as opposed to replacement animals. So short term, that's mitigated those tighter supplies. That's continuing, the USDA data tells us. So it's at 39.9% of total cattle on feed in 1,000 plus head feed yards are heifer. That's the highest since 2001. So a lot of indication that, we're still seeing very strong herd contraction as we look at those heifers on feed and are not entering the reproductive side of things.
And mentioned that the placements for feedlots were down a little bit. And another report that the USDA has recently released on July 21st was the cattle inventory report. And once again, seeing a lot of percentages compared to last year down.
So this is our biannual report. We get a snapshot of cattle inventories in the U.S. twice a year as of January 1, and this one is as of July 1. This mid-year report is just national. So in January, we get state-level inventories. The one in July, it's just national. So, we're looking at things in aggregate, and really they came within pre-report expectations. The headline numbers we're always looking at here are the beef cow numbers. So those were down 2.6% compared to a year ago and really close to pre-report expectations. If there was maybe a bit of a surprise, heifers for replacement number was down 2.4%. Pre-report expected it down even more. So, I think there's still a lot of, uncertainty about the number of heifers that are going into feedlots, the number that are going to be held back for replacement. And so, we're going to digest some of these numbers over the coming weeks and months to really see what that level of herd replacement is. But generally, it shows us the same story here, that herd contractions continuing. As you look at the beef cow herd and the slaughter of beef cows we've had through 27 weeks here in 2023, we've culled 6.2% of the national herd. That's the second highest culling percent ever compared to last year. So last year was 6.88%. So you have to go back to 1986 is when we have the data available. We've never culled this large a percentage. Only last year was larger. So, that gives us a strong indication that we're still in a large contractionary phase in this cattle inventory cycle. When you look at feeder cattle outside feedlots, that was down 3.6%. So what does that mean? Very tight feeder cattle supplies coming ahead, right? So we've seen strength in the feeder cattle market. That's really expected to continue. The calf crop was down almost 2%. So again, indication that we're seeing tight supplies for several more years now until we see some herd rebuilding. One quick calculation that you can make in this cattle inventory report and looking at the cattle on feed report is the number of cattle in feedlots with less than 1,000 head capacity. So you compare the cattle inventory, which is all cattle on feed, the cattle on feed report, which is 1,000 plus head feed yards. And what it shows is the number of cattle in small feedlots is actually down 5%. Number in larger feedlots is only down 1.8%. So I think, it gives an indication here that with these really strong feeder cattle prices, maybe that has tempered some enthusiasm in some smaller farmer feeders when you look at placement costs, especially with relatively high feed costs as well, in what those placements would require.
And this report just came out this last Friday. And so will we slowly see this kind of make impacts to the cattle market for producers?
When you look at the cattle inventory report, this report is really going to impact markets medium to long term, right? So they're not short term alterations or possibles for those in the markets, because here, we're talking about an inventory at a point in time. If we look at reports that can impact markets, cattle on feed certainly a little bit more. But as I, talked through that report, I think it is relatively neutral, maybe a tone of bearishness, but I don't see that really playing out in the marketplace. So, the cattle inventory report here, I think, points to continued herd contraction. Again, we'll get another update in January, but, we're looking at likely the low in those inventory numbers in 2024, 2025 yet. So, continue to monitor the situation, but all signs point to, very strong prices going forward.
That was Iowa State livestock economist Lee Schulz. The resources that we mentioned in today's show will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing space and how it relates to agriculture. And in to talk about it, we have K-State Precision Ag economist Terry Griffin, and he's joined by statewide director of University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, Kathy Draeger. Kathy, Terry, thank you for joining me today.
It's good to be here, Shelby.
Thank you. Glad you're interested.
Getting started with you, Terry, wanting to talk about what is ionic sulfuric scintillation.
One of the issues that came up initially was GPS not being operational in some places in the world due to solar activity. And the way I understand it as being a non-physicist is when the signals coming from the GPS satellites are entering the atmosphere and there is scintillation in the atmosphere, it could cause those signals not to arrive at the Earth's surface to be received by the globes on tractors or even the GPS on our cell phones in a way that the receivers can interpret the information and get an accurate location fix, or maybe even not even have a location fix at all. And when these events occur, it's been annoying, more so than catastrophic, for those areas. And when I say area, it could be as small as a county or a few counties in geographic size, and could last moments or a few hours. But when it's a GPS is not getting a location fix, and it's in the heat of planting or spraying or even harvesting, it could be quite frustrating.
Kathy, you also have another event you want to talk about, is the Carrington style events.
First off, I'll just say that as a soil scientist by training, I've really, for the first time, oriented my researcher eye up towards the sun and was really interested to find that solar flares are an event that happens often, as Terry described. They're not unusual. In fact, I receive alerts when they happen, and we've had 3 minor flares just today. And so those solar flares, they can have impacts that range from annoying. And Terry and I have received emails from colleagues in, extension and research saying, oh, that solar storm messed up my trial plots because I was using my auto steer to plant my plots, and they get messed up because the GPS isn't quite right, as Terry described. The other extreme is something like the Carrington event, which was a large solar flare that was observed by an astronomer in Britain in 1859. and he drew pictures of it. So we have the record, we have what he observed. And then about 17 hours later, all of the telegraph stations that we were aware of on the planet at the time experienced high voltage. There were some that started on fire. The operators were shocked. And so we know that large flares can impact our infrastructure. And so I think we're right now in the last, I would say, 15 or so years, we're having increased attention on how we harden our infrastructure, like our electrical grid, to be able to respond to a very large solar event, like a Carrington event, which is predicted to happen every 100 or 200 years. And since the last one was in 1859, it will serve us well to pay attention to this as a event that could occur anytime. Especially, I will just say right now, we're entering what they call solar maximum, which is every 11 years, there's a cycle in the sun. And right now we're entering a cycle where there's a lot more activity. There's a lot more sunspots, and those sunspots spawn these solar flares, which then can have implications on our planet.
Why are we coming back now in 2023 and really talking some more about it?
So Kathy mentioned that solar cycles are about 11 years in length, and we're approaching the maximum. Well, think about 11 years ago. We did have GPS, but we did not rely upon it as much as we do today. And then look back 22 years ago or previous 3-4 cycles, it doesn't take that many cycles going back in time to where we did not have as strong reliance upon digital agriculture as we do today. And that's why I believe 11 years ago, we may not have even noticed these things like we do today.
I'll just second what Terry said. As we've increased our reliance on technology for everything, and Terry has done some interesting research in Kansas that shows the uptake of those technologies by farmers. And so we know that farmers are depending on this more and more. And at the same time, we have a growing awareness that there may be vulnerabilities to our dependence on some of that technology in light of the activity on the sun, which was never an issue. In 1859, unless you were a telegraph operator, you wouldn't have even known that there was a solar flare.
The exception of that would be the Aurora Borealis being visible at southern latitudes, So it was actually a really cool thing if you were alive in 1859. That being said, just watch the news about when Aurora Borealis here in the Northern Hemisphere should be visible. Unfortunately, we did have some fake news about it about a week or two ago, but we do have more prevalence of Aurora in the last several months than we have in the previous several years. I remember, I think it was in the early 1990s, I could see Aurora one time when I was living in Arkansas, which is really, really far south to see those. But just keep an eye on when Aurora are visible from, Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota. Those are corresponding to those same types of solar events.
That's a great point, Terry. The visible sign that we're having a geomagnetic storm that is caused by the sun is the Aurora Borealis. So that's how you know that that's what's happening. So the auroras are the visible sign of a geomagnetic storm.
As we've had an increase in technology, you guys have pointed out, we've had an increase in activity. Have you guys had an increase in people wanting you to further your research and gain more information on this topic?
I'm really happy to let you know that Terry and I are co-principal investigators on writing a white paper for the Extension Disaster Education Network. And we're going to be trying to really, for almost the first time, define how these solar storms, what it's called space weather, can impact agriculture. Again, starting from just the glitch and the annoyance to probably more serious consequences of space weather.
I would ask our listeners, when they're spraying herbicides or planting seeds or even harvesting the crops, one of the questions, I've been hearing for the last 20 years is, should I get automated guidance on tractors, combines? And, we've seen the uptake, 2/3 of planted acres in the United States have GPS that comes across it for planting or harvest. And think about it this way, what if this technology that we've grown to be accustomed to goes away? We may have adopted it when we had 6-row or 8-row planters, But now that we've done away with row markers, we've expanded that to 48 row planters. So those do not lend themselves to getting mechanical, visible row markers and rely upon GPS guidance for making parallel passes with those. What if we do not have access to GPS for a day during the planting season? It's going to be annoying, frustrating, it's not necessarily catastrophic if we have to take the day off and make up the planting date sometime in late May instead of mid-April. But there will be yield penalties for doing so. And if we have to move that day from April to May, not only for that one field, but every farm operation in, let's say, Kansas has to do that. Well, that's a bunch of bushels that are no longer available for marketing. And that's going to have implications for rural communities, not only the farm operations, but could also affect the elevators and traders and so forth. So it's going to have a ripple effect going through the whole agricultural industry.
What can Kansas and Minnesota producers, or really any producers around the world, do?
So I think by number one, what Terry and I are going to try to do is to define the problem, potential problem, and what potential impacts it'll have. I mean, I feel like there's still a lot of question marks because it's going to range by geography. The farther north you are, the more impacts you'll have if it's a solar storm, because they affect, like, the aurora borealis. It's brighter when you're in Alaska than when you're in Kansas, right? So the farther north you go, the more impact you have from those geomagnetic storms. So we have to have some difference in geography, and then that'll cause a difference in what crops might potentially be impacted. One of the things I'm interested is, Terry's an expert in precision agriculture and the economics and impacts therein. And I'm interested in also supply chains for food and agriculture products. And so I'm interested in how we keep the system resilient as well. For example, what do we need to do to make sure the electric grid is prepared to handle different levels of solar storms? And we're seeing, like, for example, I do sit on a rural electric co-op board and was recently at a Western Area Power Administration meeting. And they are actually starting to experiment with how they can make their grid more resilient, literally to solar storms and space weather. So I think building a system around us that can weather a solar storm, it'll go a long way to helping farmers keep producing their food. And I've brought this up in meetings with other government agencies, making sure that we're making a system that allows the food supply to continue to work as efficiently and, frankly, elegantly as it currently does.
That was statewide director of University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, Kathy Draeger, and she was joined by K-State Precision Ag economist Terry Griffin. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday segment with some more wildlife information. And this week, we're joined with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And today, you wanted to talk about voles. And so, why are we talking about them?
We're talking about voles today because on a fairly regular basis, I get calls from some producers around Kansas and homeowners around Kansas that are having problems with voles. And typically that means that we're towards a peak in the vole cycle and they're at pretty high abundance. So I figured we would talk about that since I'm getting some calls about those critters right now.
And where are people likely to see these voles?
Voles can be pretty much in any heavily vegetated environment. So in lawns, in the turf grass, they can be out in hay meadows. They can even be in crop fields if there's enough cover, also orchards, vineyards, and those sorts of areas.
So causing some damage to those different places.
That's right. The typical damage that we see from voles in Kansas would be to turf grass because they make paths through it. They cut hay along those paths. They're herbivores, so they're eating vegetation. They prefer to eat broadleaf plants when they can, and so they oftentimes select specialty crops that folks are growing either as ornamental plants or as produce of some kind. And during the wintertime, they will eat bark when green vegetation is not all that common. And so during that time of the year, they can be a problem to ornamental trees, ornamental shrubs, vines, and also orchards. So fruit or nut trees that folks are growing.
Something that people don't want to see around their property. And so how can you manage these?
The two main options that come to mind for most people are trapping or the use of toxicants or poisons. And trapping on a small scale, like in one's yard or in a garden, can be very effective. On broader scales, like if we're thinking about in maybe a specialty crop garden or in an alfalfa field or something like that, it takes too many traps and would take too much time for that to be effective. So the main control method in those larger areas is going to be toxicants. The main toxicant that is registered for Vole Control in Kansas is chlorofascinone. It's a first-generation anticoagulant. So basically it causes whatever eats it to hemorrhage on the inside and then sort of bleed to death on the inside, which isn't fun to think about, but that's how it works. It's incredibly toxic to most mammals. It's much less toxic to birds. So there is a risk to any mammal that eats it of dying or at least becoming sick. And there's also some secondary toxicity risks. And because of those concerns, it's a restricted use pesticide. So you have to have a license that says that you've gone through the training to know how to use this stuff as safely as possible.
People are wanting to even work before they get to having to trap or poison voles. What is something they could do?
So some other options that we might call integrated pest management type things. One of them is just managing cover. So voles like to have a lot of cover. So if you're in an orchard or a vineyard or something like that, mow the grass short. Don't have tall grass. Also, don't blow the hay up against things that you're trying to protect because you don't want the voles to be able to use that hay as cover. Thinking more broadly, attracting other wildlife to be pest control agents can work sometimes. And as I was thinking about this, I did some searching and found a relatively recent study out of Japan where they were controlling voles in apple orchards by putting up owl boxes to attract breeding pairs of owls to come into the apple orchard to increase predation on the voles. And long story short, what they found was by attracting those owl pairs to nest in the apple orchards, they were able to reduce abundance of the voles within the territory of the owls by 63%. They weren't able to measure whether or not that equated to a reduction in damage, but one would assume that if we're reducing the vole abundance by 63%, then that's going to reduce damage at probably a noticeable scale.
And if people are wanting to build owl nest boxes, how do you recommend they find out how to do that?
If you do a Google search for barn owl nest box or great horned owl nest box or barred owl nest box, you can find plans for the appropriate nest box dimensions and placement for all of those different species. You can also potentially buy a box if you'd like to buy a box.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you this Monday on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.